Aha! This is Laborz, and these are the paints I used in this video. Okay, so first I sketch out the reflections of the surface that will reflect the sky. The tricky part about that, I need to paint the reflections of the environment, and the problem is that we don't really have one, except for the rubble on the base. So we need to expand that rocky vicinity with our imagination. For this mini, the classic flat rocky desert will be our environment. So no rocks above sea level, just a vast desert-like biome. So first I paint these reflections and separate them with some thin black lines. But what are the black lines for? What reflections are those? So in the middle between the two rackets, those are actually the reflections of the rackets themselves. And on the top, well, on the top I just thought it looks nice. Painting chrome is a little bit tricky, so we add a couple of random reflections to it like we would do with any other NMM, just for some visual interest. The lower half of the rackets should reflect the ground, so that's why I leave those areas black for the moment. I cover the lower half of the rocket with Morphing Brown, leaving a thin black line between the blue-gray and the Morphing Brown areas. That thin black line will be the horizon between the sky and the ground. This line doesn't have to be perfect or super straight, since that is the edge of the landscape, which is not completely straight either. Next, I used Lycy Gray to make a gradient next to the black line on the blue-gray parts. The sky usually has a lighter blue color towards the horizon, so that's why we are using this value. I also apply this over the secondary reflections, where the metal reflects itself between the two rackets. You can Google up lots of pictures that will have this kind of images. I just typed in desert POV picture, and there are a lot of stock photos you can use or generate one with AI. On these pictures you can see the ground, the horizon and the sky, and this is what we paint over our chrome surface. Using references is very important when you are painting something you are not super familiar with, so use these pictures either for color schemes or just to check your value ratios. I darkened down the upper section of the sky reflections with a heavier glaze of dark sea blue and blue-gray mixture. This value represents the darker sections of the sky. We've basically just worked in a simple gradient of dark and light blues. We could have started with the dark sea blue and work our way up to the higher values, but it doesn't really matter really. If you're more comfortable to start with the maximum value highlight, you can do that as well, whichever fits you the most. I remember when I first played with values, it was way harder for me to start with the midtone and then shade the color and then highlight. I got lost in the process and get rid of my midtone usually, but try out for yourself which process works best for you. Maybe you find it easier starting with the darkest shadow color and work your way up to the higher values, or maybe the opposite. I wasn't really happy with my gradients, so I used the airbrush for the blending to speed up the process using small bursts of paint. And if you guys think that is cheating, I will slap on your tiny hand. I go back with blue-gray as well to refine the volumes. I use gold brown on the base and the reflections that face towards the ground. This is the creative part because you can sketch out any rocky landscape over these areas that you like to. First, I start with thin layers on the rackets, but on the base itself, on the rocks, I switch to a base layer consistency. On the area that is closer to the horizon reflection, I make more blurry highlights, and as closer I get to the bottom of the surface, the more I paint little rock-like shapes that are more clear, since those are closer to our chrome surface. On the exhaust ports of the racket, I use the airbrush again and create a glow effect as the racket is just cooling off. I aim for the center of these ports and let the paint bleed over the edges of the exhaust port. To add some warmth to the effect, I use Michelangelo and reducing the highlight areas inside the wide rider red layer. The easiest way to do that is to bring the airbrush a little bit closer to the subject and using smaller bursts of paint than before. This way you don't get rid of the wide rider red layer. If you have webbing problems, then try to reduce the air pressure on your compressor. Brush, I paint small dots inside the Michelangelo layer to create the hottest part of the engine and make it more interesting by pushing the contrast. I thought the shadow areas of the character would look a little bit better if I used more blue. So I grabbed some colored sky and applied some thin layers over the darkest parts. This will make the orange jumpsuit stand out a little bit more, creating a nice color contrast for the Mini. Lastly, I add some white gray over the reflections, right next to the black lines over the areas where the surface reflects the sky. We don't need too much presence of this value, so just pick out a small section for it. I also use it over the top side of the rocket for some extra contrast on the reflections. Once I'm happy with the volumes, I start blending this layer with a glaze-like consistency, moving my brush from the lower to the higher value areas. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video was helpful. I made a step-by-step PDF guide for the character that you can access on my Patreon page. A huge thanks to the people on Patreon who support these kinds of videos, with special shout out to Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Glitchy McCrash, Penoman45, Michael Kerr, and Ramlo. I hope your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.